In this video, I'm going to look at a database normalization exercise. We're going to go to the second normal form. So we're going to look at partial dependencies on a composite primary key. And our example data is going to be Star Wars movies. So I did a combination. I took things from Wikipedia, basically this list of Star Wars films. Um, and I also had a little peek over at the international or Internet Movie Database, the IMDB. Um, so I wanted some primary keys, and so I took the primary keys from the IMDB. Okay. So we have movies. Um, so the movies have, or films, I guess I should say film. They have a title, they have a release date, they have a director, and it will always be important to us the multiplicity. So I'm going to look down the director list, and sort of for all the examples I'm seeing here, there seems to be one director. Okay. Um, That's not true for all movies, but that seems to be true, at least for this list of Star Wars movies. So I'm going to say that, there's one director for a movie. Now, screenwriters, I'm definitely seeing George Lucas and Jonathan Hales. And so that is definitely a, um, there's some repetition here. And in screenwriter definitely, but here's they've expanded this field to the screenwriter and the story by. So the story by is sometimes multi-valued, and the I guess this is the producer is also multi-valued. So we have films and release dates and directors and screenwriters and story by and producers and screenwriters and story by and producers. We definitely have examples of them being multi-valued. Okay. Now, I didn't put down all the data, I only put down some of the data, but we've seen a longer list of data, and sort of director may be single valued, but everything else was multi-valued. So the first thing one does uh, in a normalization exercise is what says that one flattens the file. So here I have this example of the screenwriter of The Empire Strikes Back is multi-valued. Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan um, were both credited with screenwriting of The Empire Strikes Back. So then we take this information uh, and repeat it. No, I screwed that up. There's the one I want. There are too many versions of pasting in Word. I think it's this one I want. Okay, so we're taking the repeated information and flattening the file. So I take the stuff that's common. So I had this multi-valued screenwriter, and then I take the repeated information, or I take the information that is for Lawrence and for George, and I repeat it. Okay. And this is known as flattening the file, and and this helps us, we are introducing some redundancy. We're repeating episode 6 and the release date, and so we're introducing redundancy, but our gain is in like searchability, that I don't have to. I wanted to do that down here, and I did it up there, but okay, you see what I did. So I did it in the wrong place. But down Here, I might have to, like, if I'm doing some kind of search and I may need to separate this out, I may need to do some parsing if this is a sort of a list within a unit. But so I don't want any lists, any multi-valued fields within the list. So then I create these rows where I have lots of redundancy, but every little thing that I might want to search is atomic, is by itself. In like we think of databases consisting of tables, which are sort of rows and columns, and then where rows and columns intersect, we should have sort of a single piece of data, a single name, not a list of names. This so we flatten the table, we move to the first normal form. And I wanted this to be down here in the flattened area, but you see what I mean. Okay. The next thing we want to do is identify a primary key for the flattened table. Okay. So now I borrowed from, I'm going to eliminate this. And so up there is now my now flattened table. Okay. And now I want to identify the primary key for the flattened table. So a primary key must uniquely identify a row. And so in my example, I explicitly had multi-valued screenwriters and had to produce multiple rows to accommodate my different screenwriters. But I know that that's also the case with the story by and the producers. And so I have this Empire Strikes Back, these two rows are identical except for the screenwriter. So I know that if I'm putting together a primary key to uniquely identify, to distinguish one of these rows from the other, then the screenwriter must be part of it. So there must be some, I don't know, screenwriter ID or something. But I know that that's the same for story by. Those are sometimes multi-valued, and the producers were sometimes multi-valued. And so I will need, and then these writers occur again. And so we see The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. We see Kazdan there, and George Lucas, of course, all over the place because it's Star Wars. So um, I'm going to need something to identify the movie because the same person may be involved with different movies. I'm going to say the director's single value. So I'm going to say that if I know the movie, I will know the release date, I will know the director. If it's single value, knowing the movie will give me the director. But knowing the movie will not give me the screenwriter, will not give me the story by, will not give me the producer because they were multi-valued. And then when I flatten the field, they will not uniquely identify the row. So I'm going to say movie ID, which I'm going to use this thing that I borrowed from uh, the IMDB. So I'm going to say movie. I need a film, like they were calling it a film. Film ID. I'm going to say that determines the release date. I'm going to say that determines the director, but it does not determine the screenwriter in my flattened field because that was multi-valued. It did not determine the story by because that was multi-valued. And that did not determine the producer because that was also multi-valued, not in my example data that I have written on in this Word document, but we saw on the Wikipedia page. Okay, and I'm going to assume that each of these has some ID, so I'm not going to use the names, I'm going to use the IDs. So this is my primary key. I want to be able to identify the writer, the story by, the producer, the film. Okay. So I want to find these records. So this is for this flattened field, for this crazy thing that I found over in Wikipedia. And then if I flattened it and I want to identify each row uniquely, I'm going to have to tell you the film, the screenwriter, the story by, and the producer to be able to pick out each individual row that might occur. Okay, so that is my primary key. Now I want to look for functional dependencies. Is there something that once I know this, I can determine other things? Um, so the film ID, which I'm taking to be this, uh, I'm borrowing the idea from uh, the IMDB, the Internet Movie Database, that there is a film ID. They have some number that's uh, some letters and then some numbers. I think it was TT or something. So TT and then this number is the New Hope, the original Star Wars from '77. And so that determines, of course, the film title, the release date, and there might, of course, be other things in there, but that is, enough. That's what was appearing in that Wikipedia page. Okay. Now I have all these other IDs, and I'm going to say that the screenwriter ID determines the screenwriter name, and screenwriter ID gives me the name. And then the same thing for story by. And the producer. And that's reminding me. So the story by ID gives me the story by name, and the producer ID gives me the producer name. And that reminds me that my director, I was considering my director to be single valued. So that was also determined by the film ID. And I'm going to put in here the director ID, but also then the director name. And that gives us some other interesting thing here, that the director ID determines the director name. So name, I'm getting lazy here, but story by ID, story by name, producer ID, producer name. So I have all these things. So the film determines the title and the release date, the director ID, and the director name. I can look up the ID or the name based. Once I know the film, I can look up everything. And it's just a matter of looking up. It's not like there's some formula where one thing determines another. It's just, can I look it up? I can. I can look up the film. I can get its title, its director, its release date, and all that information. Okay. So that's what we have in terms of our dependencies. Everything up here is sort of accounted for by something: producer, story by, screenwriter, director, release date, film. Okay. Then we start looking for partial dependencies. Okay. So what was our primary key up here was film, screenwriter, story by, and producer. So all of these things, film, screenwriter, story by, producer, not the director, but all the other ones are partials. They depend on our on a part of our primary key. You can depend on the full key. Control D. You can depend on no part of the key. So director ID, that director ID determining the director name, that didn't depend on any part of our primary key. Director ID, because it was single value, did not appear in our primary key. And so it's not a partial. And there may be things that depend on all the primary key, and that wouldn't appear. So we're looking for partials, things that depend on part of the primary key. So it's always some sublist of what's up here. It did not include the director. Now, you should have, you have to make sure like you I don't have any particular field that depends on all things. But that doesn't mean that there won't be such a table in the end. You have to be careful that you maintain your relationships. So second normal form tells you what to pull apart, what to pull out, but don't lose the original, don't lose the relationships. That's sort of an easy mistake to make in second normal form. So now we start to make um, our decomposing tables. Now, this raises an interesting point in that we have entities. We're trying to make our tables our entities and then have some relationships, and particularly with George Lucas just all over the place here as the director, especially for the first one, and then another one later on. He's the director, he's the screenwriter, he's the story by. And if you go over to the Internet Movie Database, there is one ID for George Lucas. There's not like, oh, here's George Lucas, the director, here's George Lucas, the screenwriter, it is George Lucas. And so, and that's a thing that one has to consider when um, so we have these different uh, roles that a person could play. So when we decompose in this case, um, what I want to suggest that we do is not have a screenwriter entity and a story by entity and a producer entity, but to have a person entity. And these would all be examples of the person entity, and then make this role more of something in the relationship. So the person will then have a screenwriting relationship to the film. There'll be a story by relationship between a person and a film. Okay, and this is subtle. You could have tables. You could have a director table. You could have a screenwriter table. You could have a story by table. Um, and then George Lucas would appear in each of those tables, and so would some other people. But we're going to follow sort of what the Internet Movie Database did and have a person and then have all these different roles as part of the relationships. So we're definitely going to have a film, which is going to be like have a film ID as a primary key. And that's going to determine the release date and the director date. And we'll say the director name because we're going to second normal form. And so the separation of the director ID from the director name is not going to come out in the second normal form. There are other normal forms, higher level normal forms that would make that separation, but the second normal form will not because the director ID did not get pulled out because it was single value, not multi-valued. It was determined by the film ID. And so it's not pulled out as part of the primary key. And so in second normal form, you worry about partial dependencies on the primary key. So that's not going to do anything for us. So that separation of director, a director is another person, and that could get pulled out, but the director name separated from the director because that's really just another person. But it's not happening here at second normal form. That's just the weird point of this. That we're not going all the way. We're only going to second normal form. So I'm going to have a person table. Again, modeling myself on IMDB. And so this is going to be a person ID, which the IMDB has. They were the up here, the NNs, maybe, I don't know, name, I don't know. Um, and and then that would give me the person's name and date of birth and whatever the hell else we might want to say. And then we need our relationships. So there'll be film, uh, screenwriter. There'll be and that will have a film ID and a person ID. And then the role is it's part of this table, sort of a bridge table. There, that person has a screenwriting relationship. So the person entity has a relationship to the film entity, and that relationship has a role of screenwriter. And then we could do film director. We treat it differently. A story by, and that will be similar. So I'll just not write it all out. And film producer. And so these are tables. Then we ask, did we maintain, do we have everything accounted for? We have the film. I didn't put in the film title. So I have the film's ID determining the film's title, its release date. It's also determining the director. We might pull the director out, or at least the director name out into the person table. So this could be the director ID, but we could know that it's a person ID, but that's not being commanded to us by the second normal form. That's going to require something a higher normalization than what we're doing here. But then we pulled out a person. Strictly speaking, we could have pulled out um, directors and screenwriter. Well, not pulling out directors, but screenwriters and story buys and producers. We could have pulled them all out separately, but especially sort of with George Lucas appearing in all, there would be some George Lucas redundancy there. So we decided just to make a person table, also a little bit modeled on what IMDB does. And then, but we have to make sure we have these relationships. So the relationship between the screenwriter and the film is here in what you might call a bridge table, connecting the film ID into a person ID. And the story by is another relationship between film and a person. And when you have multiple relationships, you often assign them roles. So there's many relationships between a film and a person, and we haven't even gotten into actors. But so the film screenwriter relationship, the film story by relationship, the film producer relationship. Can we uh, reproduce this information up here? Um, we have the film, we have its ID, we can get its title, we can get its release date, we can get the director ID and the director name. Then we can go to our relationships and connect the film to the screenwriters, connect the film to the story by, connect the film to the producers, so we can reproduce our original information. So that's what we want to do, sort of make searching better. That's the flattening, reduce the redundancy. We don't want George Lucas over and over and over again. So we put him in a person table and then he gets replaced all instead of having George Lucas and any information we want about George Lucas, we'll just have his ID and then we'll repeat his ID all over the place because we want the relationships. We just don't want his name. And, what if you added his middle name and his birth date and all that? Then we don't want to be repeating all that information all over the place for everything he does, for all the different roles he plays. So that was it, the second normal form exercise for the Star Wars movies. It had this uh, weird thing in that we had people playing all these different roles in a movie. And it's sort of, especially with George Lucas appearing again and again, that sort of suggested to us not to pull out a director table, a writer table, a story by table, a producer table, but to pull out a person table and just have different roles of relationships to between a person and the film. And the other thing that happened here, and just because we're only going to second normal form, the director sort of didn't get pulled out the way the others did because of its different multiplicity. That the films, all the Star Wars films anyway, all seem to have one director, whereas they had multiples of the other things. So that forced those things to be pulled out, but the director information not to be pulled out at the second normal form. That's it for this one. Thanks for your attention.